Welcome everybody to another Thursday with ThirdPath webinar. We're very excited to have Jennifer Deal joining us. She's written a wonderful book called What Millennials Want from Work. And I hope what you'll see over this course of this call is that millennials are continuing a long tradition of pushing organizations towards change. Maybe that's not what their intention is. Maybe they're just doing what makes sense to them. But what we've seen is their behaviors are a lot like what ThirdPath's pioneering leaders and integrated professionals are doing. And so we're hoping today's call shows you and everybody who listens to it that change is possible, and we really can make organizations more effective when they support people to have whole lives. And I'm thinking that Jennifer and I will have some great conversation back and forth about this. We already have a couple of different perspectives about how to interpret all this, and it should be a really fun and exciting call. So welcome, Jennifer. You've done a great job capturing some great research, and once again, I seem to not be able to get the thing to go forward. Isn't that
That's just odd.
Yeah. There we go.
There we go.
Okay.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Tell us a little bit about this book and this amazing amount of research you did on this very important topic.
So my colleague Alec Levinson at the Center for Effective Organizations and I collected data on millennials and actually 29,000 older people, older respondents from around the world, from 22 countries. And the samples primarily professional, managerial, and executive staff, and 80% had university degrees, as you see. And what we did was we didn't just send out web-based surveys, though you don't get to more than an N of more than 50,000 without sending out internet-based surveys. We actually went to different places in the world and did interviews and focus groups with both millennials and older staff, because it's good to have the numbers, but you only understand what's underneath the numbers after having talked to people and discussed with them what's really going on in their lives and how this shows up. So we did this starting a number of years ago, and finally published the book the beginning of this year. And so, as I said, the data are based on interviews, focus groups, and survey research from more than 50,000. This is talking about the millennials, just the millennial portion, which is about 25,000 people from 22 countries.
Wow.
And actually, so you all know, before this I have a previous book which looked across the generations. It's called Retiring the Generation Gap, and it looked across the generations at a bunch of different topics that are relevant to work. In this book, we decided to focus on what millennials want. We do periodically talk about older people, but really the focus is on understanding who millennials are, what they want, and what organizations can do about it.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And I thought it was interesting to point out that this was a group, I think for all kinds of reasons you looked primarily at kind of professional careers, and a significant number of them were people with university degrees. So it was a very specific group of millennials as well. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a very specific group. I work at the Center for Creative Leadership, and Alec is at the Center for Effective Organizations. The samples we look at are primarily university-educated professionals, managers, and executives. So you can decide how far you want to generalize the results, as long as you recognize that this is a very particular sample around the world. This is not a general population sample in any way.
Well, it's very relevant to the purpose of the book, which is what do millennials want from work? And there was a couple of big takeaways that your survey came up with right away. And again, I'm having a little trouble forwarding the slides. So we'll see if we have some success here. I might have to give up on this. So interesting. I don't know why this is a problem. Okay. So one of the things that you really saw was some of the things that are mentioned in this slides. Tell us a little bit about that.
So one of the really interesting things to us was people always asked, okay, we talk about millennials in the US a lot. What are millennials like in different parts of the world? And what we found was that millennials shared many of the same attitudes. regardless of where they were. Now, their day-to-day lives were different. How you live your life is different in New Delhi than it is in New Jersey. But the attitudes that people had about work were remarkably similar. What they wanted, what they expected with regard to opportunities and development, how they were sort of expecting to move within their careers and what were important to them were remarkably similar around the world. Another thing that was also very important were financial pressures and the student debt issue. This came up over and over again. It came up in the survey that we did where people actually said that they made career choices because of their concerns about debt. And one of the things that we found particularly interesting was that student debt and retirement were not just an issue in the U.S. They were also an issue in Northern European countries where we had expected it to not be a particularly big issue because of the social infrastructure there. It was an issue there to younger people. It was something they were very concerned about. And later, recently, when I was over in Austria talking to an organization about this, one of the people came up to me later and said, absolutely, that they're having real issues, and so concerns about retirement are quite significant for younger people in Northern Europe, not just in the United States.
Yeah, and I thought that was really interesting because when I read that, I was like, okay, this has got to be a U.S. thing. But then when you look at the graphs, you can see this is not just a U.S. thing. These financial pressures and worry about, student debt and retirement. That was so interesting to see. No, I mean, sad to see, but interesting to see how global it was.
How global it was, yeah. So the importance of the financial pressures, the different kinds of financial pressures are different in different parts of the world. So in some places there's very little student debt, but housing costs are crazy even by our standards, by the standards of the big cities in the U.S. So they don't have necessarily exactly the same concerns everywhere, but a lot of them are remarkably similar, which really did, as I said, which really did surprise me and Alec.
Yeah. And so on the one hand, there were these, why this PowerPoint slide says new is a kind of some new perspectives of this kind of all of them having more of a global perspective and maybe some more sense of financial pressures on them. But there were also some things that really seemed to continue a long tradition of pushing for change, I would argue, and in from my perspective, really thinking differently around how we can work, how we connect with each other, and what are the rules of the game in these new workplaces. And again, Jennifer and I will be talking about this with slight similarities and slight differences, and I think that's a good thing. She was good to help me think about how to create these slides so that they really reflect her actual findings. And one was, to really frame this slide, not that millennials are doing work differently, but millennials are doing these things, which I interpret as doing work differently. Tell me a little bit more about what you saw around how they're doing their work.
So millennials want control over what they're doing. Part of this comes out of some suspicion that their bosses and the organizations have their best interests at heart. They don't believe that necessarily. Which comes as a surprise to many executives I speak with. When I say to them, yeah, they don't actually trust that you're looking out for their best interests. They think you're looking out for either your or the organization's best interests. As a consequence, they want control over what they're doing. They want information. They want choices. They want to be able to think through what their options are. They don't just necessarily want to be told what to do all the time. So there's control over what they're doing, and then there's the control over how they're doing it. They also don't necessarily want to be micromanaged any more than anybody else does. They want to understand what the goals are, but they don't necessarily want to be told exactly how to get from point A to point C. They want their work to be flexible. What we heard from people is that they understand when they need to be in the workplace, when it's actually necessary to be there, but they don't understand why they have to be there when it isn't actually necessary for the work. The idea that face time is critical simply because that's how your manager evaluates your productivity, is something that they are about as they think it's they don't think it's reasonable any more than a lot of other people do, a lot of older people do. So they want the flexibility to be where they need to be. They have lives. They want to be able to live their lives and do good work. And so they think that flexibility is a good way to achieve that. They don't like boring or repetitive work. Last time I checked, nobody does. But when you're, I mean, really, if you like boring and repetitive work, please raise your hand. Most people don't like boring and repetitive work. They dislike it just about as much as everybody else does, for good reason, because it's boring and repetitive work. And what they often do is they say, okay, let's find another way to do this that reduces the drudgery. And they often move to technology, because technology is a new way of approaching something. It's something that most millennials are fairly comfortable with. And so they look for technological options to reduce the drudgery of what they're doing.
Yeah.
Because if you can avoid the drudgery, why wouldn't you?
Yeah. And go ahead.
Oh, and I was going to say, and they do offer new technologies as a way to improve work processes. Oftentimes, you know of a better way to do something, so you suggest it, and it doesn't always go over for a variety of reasons. But they do offer these new technologies to improve work process.
And your point in that book when you were talking about this was how it's an opportunity for organizations to kind of learn some new things themselves, and that's probably helpful. And actually what I took away when I saw this was it was really exactly what we've learned from our integrated professionals. They've learned, we really teach our integrated professionals that you can flex work in 4 ways. When you work, where you work, who does the work, or how much work you're doing. And that's the one in particular that we were talking about. So I go into it drill into it a little bit more detail about, we've really learned if you want to be an integrated professional, you have to kind of say, here's how much work I can do in the time I have available. And then beyond that, it's going to be spilling into the time and energy you want for life. So you have to kind of get smart about workflow, the how much of work you do. And so we actually have a standard handout right on our free resources page about this concept. And if you look at the bullet points under how much work you do, negotiate deadlines, systematize tasks so they take less time, do something we call good enough mode, find that simpler way to get something done, or reduce or eliminate inefficient work practices. So there's a long history of professionals who wanted to have time for their lives to think this way and say, hey, we can use technology, we can use work efficiencies to figure out how to do work in a way where it doesn't take over our lives. We get the most important work done and still have time and energy for our lives. So it was fun to see that contrast of what millennials want sure look a little bit like what our integrated professionals are doing. There's many other subjects that were great in this book. One of them was this concept of, do millennials connect at work differently or want something different from their connection at work? You want to talk a little bit about that, Jennifer?
Sure. So millennials really want connections at work. It's very important to them. If you think in terms of life stage, which is something Alec and I talk a lot about when we're talking about this, if you think in terms of life stage rather than generation, what you actually think about is where people are in their lives. Do they have a spouse? Do they have children? Do they have people they're taking care of? Are they single, hanging out with friends? And what you find is that younger people tend to be in life stages where friends are more important, where they spend more of their time with friends because they don't have necessarily a spouse or children or those sorts of obligations yet. So having people at work, especially given the number of hours they're working, who they really get along with, who they're friends with, who they feel like they're part of a community with, is really important to millennials. It isn't that having friends at work and having people they like at work isn't important to older people. It is. It's that because of the life stage millennials are in, the younger millennials, not the 35-year-olds, but the younger millennials are in, this part of work is much more important to their day-to-day life. And it's something that that really keeps people at an organization. It really is one of the things that they look forward to. What millennials said to us is, what's the point of going to work if, I don't like the people? I may like the work, but if I don't like the people, I'm spending so much time there, I need to go somewhere else and find my people, basically, the people I want to be with. And what we found was that when we were talking to people, they said that they were really energized. They really loved their work when the people they were hanging out with, because they were there for 12 hours a day, some of these people 14, where the people really were sort of friends as well as team members, people who are really part of their community, who they actually often chose to do things with after work as well. This was different from older people who, of course, had other, because of their life stage, had other obligations. We also heard from millennials that they really want mentoring and feedback. When you come into a new organization, you don't necessarily know how everything works, and one of the really good ways to learn about it is from mentors. And they get that. They realize that. They want the coaching. They want to know what they can do better, because people have said a lot of nasty things about millennials, but I've never heard anybody say that they don't want to be successful. And the ones we spoke with and what we saw in the survey is that they really feel like one of the ways they can be successful in their lives is through finding mentors who will coach them and through getting feedback from people who see their work and can help them understand where they're doing good enough work and could maybe get a little better, where they're doing great work, and where they really need some direction and need some assistance. Because again, they want to be successful. And a really good way to be successful is to know where you aren't necessarily measuring up so you can work on that. They also do communicate through technology. This is something people go on and on about. But in truth, the face-to-face connection, especially for communicating things that are important to them, was their preferred way of communicating. So they might send a text, they might send an email, but when it comes to anything that's important, they want to discuss it face-to-face.
And again, it was just so interesting reading your book and seeing some parallels. This one has a twist, the parallel, because what we really learned from our integrated leaders, so these are leaders who moved ahead in their careers while also really creating time for their lives outside of work. Often that time was family time, male and female leaders. We saw that the only way that that integrated leader could move ahead was to build a strong team around them. So when I was reading Jennifer's book, I was like, wow, our integrated leaders build this kind of connection naturally because they need it themselves. They need a good team around them to have their own work-life balance. So if you listen to the integrated leader stories, you'll hear that they've done a number of skills. We have this list of 21st century skills that people can get on our website. And I've listed a few of them here that really show how those integrated leaders very intentionally build strong connection in their team and a sense of reciprocity so that they can all work together to accomplish the goals. And what's interesting, they do this, yes, face-to-face, but I have a number of integrated leaders who have virtual teams. And they have really learned how to build connection in a virtual world too and know the importance of that in a deep, deep way. We're actually going to be talking about this on our next Thursday webinar. And that, there is some really important ways that people can build a sense of team virtually. Interestingly, they know that in order to really create a great virtual team, you do need to get together face-to-face sometimes for all kinds of important reasons, including the ones that Jennifer outlined in her book. So it was just again, this parallel between what millennials are looking for and what I feel like the future of work can look like. It turns out connection is a really important part of work. And you can do it face-to-face, you can do it virtually, and even if you do it virtually, you need to include some face-to-face time. Of course, what we've heard over and over again is that, millennials want time for life outside of work. So perhaps one reason they've been figuring this all out is because they've been doing what our integrated professionals did, wanting to work but wanting time and energy for life outside of work. Want to tell us a little bit more about that? And I've heard you say a couple times so far about millennials who are working 12-hour days and 14-hour days. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in a little bit too. But what does it look like to want time for life outside of work?
Yeah, so the millennials we spoke with and surveyed were typically in fairly high pressure jobs with fairly large amounts of time with clients oftentimes. Some of the work was cyclical, some of it wasn't, was consistent, but they said that when things got really bad, they could be working consistently until 11 o'clock at night, starting at 8 or 9 in the morning, for short periods of time when they were on deadlines. And they said that that was okay with them as long as when they had their off times, they really had off times. And the problem was that for many, that didn't exist anymore, largely because of the smartphone and the expectation that they be connected to work all the time. And so understanding how easy it is for work to take over your life, they really looked for organizations and for bosses within organizations who understood the importance of having a life, not just having, a career. And they really focused on figuring out where they could go that would give them that. Sometimes it was moves within the same organization to a different division that had more flexibility and better work-life balance. Other times it was moving to a boss who is known for sort of working with people to make sure that everybody has a life, not just a job. But they really did look for that and prioritize that. And I believe it's partially because they recognized from watching the people around them and above them how easy it is for work to take over their life. And they don't want that, the ones we spoke with.
Yeah, yeah. And it is. I mean, I think that is one of the biggest changes I've seen at ThirdPath. We've now been around for 15 years, and I actually would argue in some ways it's harder to step away from work today than it was 15 years ago. But again, learning from these pioneers who've gone ahead of us, we're seeing that these integrated professionals have learned some tricks that we can learn from. And we've really worked hard as an organization to cull them down into some resources for others to learn from. So again, here's another free resource you can get from our website that we think is a really good outline of the key integration practices that we're seeing from these integrated professionals. And so, as much as it might look like it's an annoyance to that workaholic leader that millennial wants to go off to yoga class at 5 o'clock, even though they're willing to come back and work until 11 during that peak period of work, it turns out that yoga class is really good for the organization and for the millennial. And so we've learned this over and over again, that when you actually take that pause and take time to reflect, it actually helps you get a better perspective of what you're trying to work on and what's most important. So in some ways, stepping away for an hour for yoga or an hour and a half and then coming back to a problem actually could help you solve it better. And so no wonder those millennials are looking for those leaders who are trying to support that, because it turns out it really is effective for everybody. And yes, there's going to be crunch times, but what I loved what Jennifer said is that they're willing to roll up their sleeves and do the extra work during the crunch time, but they want some time outside of that. In fact, we've had calls where we talk about how do you really turn off work while you're on vacation, because we've learned from our integrated leaders how you can do this. So we, again, are seeing this parallel. What millennials are looking for, I feel like there's a road ahead of them they can follow around this integrated approach. And a big key point is, in point number 4, it's a process, not a solution, and that we're going to actually all make some mistakes and learn from those mistakes of when things aren't going the right way or when we've taken it the wrong direction, and try again and figure out a better solution. So there's this really great truth that I believe the millennials are asking for something that we can really help them see. There is an integrated approach to work, and we're going to talk a little about that in a second and look at a couple of case studies. The last big takeaway, there's many others, but the one I'm focusing on, it was this last couple of takeaways about wanting to know what the rules are and a willingness to leave if they can find something better. Do you have any more thoughts you want to say about that, Jennifer?
Yeah, so a lot of people say that millennials are really anti-authority, and we didn't actually find that at all. We didn't find that millennials dislike authority. What we found was that they want to know, they basically want to know what the rules are. They want to know who makes the rules. They want to know what the rules are, so that they can then decide, they can make decisions about what they want to do and what they don't want to do. What upsets them and what upsets older people is when they don't know what the rules are, they don't know what the expectations are when things aren't clear. So that was one thing that was particularly important to millennials. We also found that as much as millennials are generally satisfied with their jobs, they're looking to find something better, because you can always improve. Very few people told us that they couldn't find things that they would prefer in their jobs, aspects of their jobs, things that would make jobs better. And part of the reason when people ask me about this, they say, well, but if they're happy, why don't they stay? And the answer is because most people, most millennials, don't actually believe that they can stay in an organization forever. They believe that they are considered to be disposable by those that employ them, and therefore they believe that they have to keep an eye out for what other opportunities are there. They basically can't trust that the organization will keep them around, even if they want to be kept around. And by and large, millennials, really would like to stay with an organization for a long time, but they don't necessarily trust that that will be possible. So they keep an eye out for other opportunities that might be better for them, understanding that their organization, their bosses are likely doing the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. And so again, I think there's some important messages there that they would stay. They're not people who want to leave, but they're willing to leave if they see something better. And I think that's something that's been probably to, I would argue, the millennials' betterment, that they are willing to kind of go ahead and take some risks now and find a place that can really support them to work in the way that makes sense, where they're doing a great job at work but also having time for their lives. In fact, we have, in our last newsletter and on our website, we have a Meet the Pioneer story about a woman who's now older than a millennial but made many wise choices when she was in that early stage of her career, where she really did find that took some steps to really make sure she found that right workplace. And I think that's actually something we should support millennials to think about. Now is the time to go ahead and kind of look around and find that place that's going to really support their vision of what they want to do around both work and their life outside of work. And I love this point that they want to know what the rules are. Interestingly, and I didn't get a chance to talk to Jennifer about this before, but I was thinking about this more after we talked. At ThirdPath, we're very clear, we're very upfront about what the quote-unquote rules are of how to work in a virtual workplace, because we all can't see each other. So we have to know, well, how do we, do we stick to our work times? If we want to work at a different time, how do we inform each other? If someone sends an email, how quickly do we need to get back to each other? If there's an emergency, how do we connect with each other about that? And there's a lot of clarity about how we work together in this virtual workplace. And so I think it's actually really smart that they want to know what the rules are in a world where the rules are changing a lot. So I had a couple of case studies that I was going to have us talk about. But the big message is going to be, there's the rules of how we work right now, and then there's the kind of the rules that are unexpressed in the culture of the organization. And I want to make sure we have time to talk about that too. So I put a couple of case studies up from your book. One was about Carl. You probably will remember him. He was somebody who said, hey, if I work until 8 o'clock at night, then maybe I don't need to come in until 11 o'clock the next morning. Do you remember what happened in that case study and how it was resolved? It was an interesting twist there.
Yes. So the issue was that Carl was working really late, and he just preferred to work late and come in late. The problem was that him doing so was actually inconveniencing the rest of his team. And his boss had multiple conversations with him about coming in earlier in the morning, and Carl basically ignored his boss. And so eventually the boss basically set up a morning meeting so that he had to come in, so that it was clear that everybody on the team was expected in at a certain time. The boss, the point of the story was that Carl wanted to do what he wanted to do, but by doing that, he was actually inconveniencing the rest of his team. Work actually wasn't getting done. The boss didn't care really what hours Carl worked. What the boss cared about was about the fact that the work wasn't getting done because Carl wasn't there, and he was actually needed there physically to get the work done.
Right.
So that was that story.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go on to the second one?
Well, that was the one I was just talking about, where that person wanted to take a break for yoga. And I again, just watching the clock, the time will slip by very quickly. There's two ways of interpreting these case studies, and I think both are valid. And this is where the fun part gets to go. You know, we get to think a little bit together about this. Because absolutely, one message we've learned from our integrated leaders is that there's going to be peak periods of work. There are going to be some times when people have to, work a little longer, work in the evenings, maybe even work over a weekend, because there truly is a time-sensitive thing that has to happen and requires more hours. And I could tell you many, many stories where people have not really done their side of that equation, picked up and done their fair share in making that peak period work well. But then there's the other side where it doesn't become peak, it becomes chronic, and it becomes a place where it's just normal for everybody to work from 8 until 11. And again, not necessarily that that's even a bad thing. Maybe that's just the culture of the organization. So that's what I wanted to talk about next, is that to give millennials some information and have them think about, there really are some different work cultures out there. And there's not necessarily a good or bad work culture. We happen to like one better than the other, but it's really up to the millennial to notice these cultures and then think about which is the best fit for them. So we've labeled one a work-first work culture. And some of the case studies, because of who you guys looked at, I think probably were work-first work cultures. And even though the rules might not be expressly said, it's pretty clear that if you work 24/7 and you're happy to work evenings and weekends and you are happy to work on vacations, you're probably going to be someone who's going to move ahead in that organization. But we also have seen some problems with those organizations around chronic overwork, and I'll talk about that in a second. The other is what we call a strategically flexible work culture. And so in this work culture, and we're seeing more of these, we've seen these integrated leaders. At least some of them have modeled an integrated approach to work and life. But more importantly, in a flexible work culture, the norms for everyone is to be strategically responsive. So that doesn't mean every night we're expecting you to check email, but there might be a period of time when we're all working a little bit longer and we need to be responsive during that peak period. And that, believe it or not, there really are organizations out there who have the goal that people turn off work on vacations, because what they've learned is that it actually helps people refresh, come back recharged. I actually had an interesting conversation with a group of leaders about how they support each other to not come back to a cascade of emails even after vacations. So there really is a group of people doing work differently, organizations doing work differently, leaders doing work differently within organizations that are supporting a more strategically flexible approach to work. We don't have time to talk about it today, but one of the things we've really seen is that these different approaches actually are good for organizations to take that more strategically flexible approach. Now, we might have some differences of opinion about this. It might turn out certain work cultures and types of work really require a work-first approach, and I'm open to us talking about that today. But we've really seen, even in law firms, there are some really progressive law firms that are doing things very differently, and I think there's some real organizational benefits from doing this work differently. So, Jennifer, I know that you and I talked a little bit about this, and I think a big message is we're not trying to say here's the right or wrong way to do it, but when you see all this, what would you add? What do you think a millennial would think about all this? And then we're going to ask our millennials what they think about all this.
I don't know what what millennials would think about these things in particular, because it would depend on which ones I was talking to. Some of the millennials I talked to were very happy to work incredible hours. Part of their plan was to work crazy hours into their 30s, then get themselves set up so that they could have a life for the rest of their career. And this was actually quite deliberate on their part. What they were trying to do was basically shoot the moon early, so that then they would be in a position of enough power and control over their careers to be able to make choices. So in essence, moving from a work-first orientation to work to achieve a goal, the goal being partially being able to move into a career that's more flexible over time. Others said, you know what, I don't know that I'm going to shoot the moon, so I'm going to go for, flexible and having a life first, and I'll be happy with that, because I don't think that the first approach is something I want to be doing. But it really depended on which millennials I was talking to. I talked to people who had very different expectations and desires with regard to this.
Well said. I love that way of describing it, because actually in our some of our integrated leaders did exactly that. They really were in organizational cultures, especially law 20 years ago. You really had to do a work-first orientation to move ahead in many of these law firms. But then once they made partner, they had a little bit more flexibility. So there is definitely some precedent around taking that approach. That's really cool. And that's what we believe. There's going to be different approaches for different people. And if we go, back to some of those key integration practices, getting to know yourself and what's important to you is going to be a really important step in making the right decisions. So there is going to be lots more we could say, but we did want to kind of open it up to the millennials who are on the call to hear what they might have to say about what they've heard today, and to think a little about, what has made sense so far around. Let me just put the slide up. I know what it is there's a little slow feedback on my computer. There we go. And to hear what their thoughts are about some of these questions that I have. I see, I have to unmute all. Let's see, try it again. And then we're going to open it up to the audience to hear their thoughts about some of these things as well. So I'm working on my buttons, which seems to be a theme today. And we're going to unmute everybody and get their thoughts on this. There we go. Kirsten, I got you unmuted. Yay! So we have 3 millennials who are joining us today, and we're going to have them think a little bit about, what they've heard, and what their thoughts are about, was there something surprising that they heard? Was there a path that sounded like one that they were most interested in trying themselves, or maybe already on? And then, what trade-offs do they think might be connected to that path? Kirsten, thank you for going first, and we're so glad you're here to share your thoughts.
Thank you. This is a great presentation. It's interesting to hear how even like the global perspective from millennials. I thought that was really fascinating. I have to say that I don't know that I was particularly surprised, but I love seeing everything very well crystallized. I think it really touches on the pulse of at least my experience as a millennial. I'm on the slightly older side of that cohort, and so, or the generation, and so I think one of the things that I really appreciated, and I don't know that I'd seen before, was sort of just kind of confining the years to 1980 and 1995. That actually was really meaningful to me, because I think one of the major touch points for at least my peers, I think it was 9/11 and then the financial crash a few years later. In terms of how we made some of our financial decisions and our work decisions, I think we thought that the path, we were told to find paths, at least those of us who were graduating in that first few years, but it hasn't exactly played out. Grad school and law school haven't been the sure bets that we were told they would be. So the path that seems, I think, most interesting to me, that's really tough. I think that strategic flexibility is something that definitely resonates, and that's because of that uncertainty that that I've seen in sort of job options, and knowing, what the rules are, knowing what you're capable of achieving, having the mentors, all of that. I think sometimes the more strategically flexible path seems to have that more built into it than the work first. And I could be wrong. That's just sort of what I've observed. But certainly I think that those are the places that are often more creative and don't always bring in the money, the financial gain, as quickly as you would like it to have. You might have that great startup and things really take off, or you don't. And so I certainly understand that, other approaches.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is great. I feel like I'm still thinking it through.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, Kirsten. And for someone who's thinking it through, you said some very articulate and helpful things, because what I heard, and I'll ask Jennifer if she wants to add anything afterwards, was, again, the importance of whatever environment you're in, getting some mentoring and feedback, and that you really see this as an interactive, you're really working on your career and getting support around thinking about your career. And so that's a really important thing for you. And that, money's going to be important, but also some support around these other issues, mentoring, flexibility, alongside good enough money so you can make sure that you're meeting your financial needs, especially given some of the history that you've lived through. You've learned the importance of keeping your eye on that financial support and solution as well. So wonderful. Thank you for sharing all that. That was very helpful. Jennifer, there might be a thought you want to ask Kirsten, none required, and then I'm going to check in with Ariel too.
Well, I just wanted to, Kirsten, I just wanted to reinforce what you said about the recession. We heard where you were in your career or school when the recession hit had a big effect on what millennials were able to do post-recession. And so, yeah, that's kind of an understatement, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so one of the things we really heard from millennials is that it radically affected their expectations for the workplace and where they had to focus, where they really felt they had to focus, because fairly soon you're an adult and you have, a roof to keep over your head and food to purchase. And so thinking about what you want to do, what you can do, what pays the bills, combined with what kind of life you want to have becomes much more complicated in situations post-recession, especially just post-recession. And so that was something we heard a lot from millennials, particularly in the U.S., though we did hear it in different parts of the world. So that's all.
Kirsten, any thoughts about that? None required. I'm going to share one other thought.
No, that resonates.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I actually graduated right at the recession from college.
Yeah.
So choices about where to find a job and wondering if there was even a world that would employ you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But listening to you, Kirsten, made me think about one more slide I want to put up there before we hear from Ariel, because I think what Jennifer said early on is that this is also a life stages discussion, and so at some point, not all of us, but some of us are hoping to be with a partner. And, for some of us, it's going to be a two-parent household, mom and dad, not all of us. And one other interesting fact is that there's a really great study out there that show that 2/3 of millennial men want to share caregiving responsibilities. So why do I put that slide up right now? Well, if you think about the financial health of a family, and you think about it as a two-parent household, whatever that two-parent household looks like, then it's two people figuring that out together. And so what also has changed over the 15 years that ThirdPath has existed is men's interest in sharing caregiving responsibilities. And so in February, we're going to have a Thursday webinar where we talk about how young families are thinking ahead about how to make it all work. And the opportunity there is that you have two people who are potentially earning money but doing it in a way that also is taking care of the family, where both parents can really share in the caregiving responsibility. So I just want to put that out there that, there's a life stages part. You're on your own early in your life stage figuring out career, but hopefully, because you've taken some time, you've found a partner, and then together you're figuring all this out. And it's quite amazing how two people together can come up with a wider range of solutions. Kirsten, you don't have to say anything in response to that, but if you have a thought, I'd be happy to hear it, and then we'll hear from Ariel.
No, thank you for just letting me share today.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Wonderful. I know you have to get off at exactly 2. We're going to probably try to tie it up at around 2 too. So, Ariel, thank you for listening in, and tell us a little bit about what you've heard today that feels like it's been useful, surprising, and what, if any of those paths ring of interest to you. Welcome, Ariel.
Sure, thank you for having me. I definitely appreciate the entire presentation. A lot of the times when you're classified as a millennial, unless you're a research junkie, you don't really care what other people think that means, but it's interesting to see a lot of the similarities to my life and other people in this classified generation, just in general, to see the similarity. So that was nice to see, and that I feel like I fall more in the middle of the age range. I was born in '87, so not quite at the tip top, but not at the end. So I'm like right in that life stages point where I have a husband, but because of the financial strain that's mentioned, we're waiting to have kids. But he's already expressed his interest in homeschooling our children, and whenever that happens. But he's also an actor, and he's getting his MFA right now, so that also adds an additional layer of financial planning, because as an artist, any type of artist, you get paid in passion, not in coins. So a lot of the times that kind of falls within in my realm, or at least where both of us have to kind of make some very serious decisions about when we want to start a family, because debt management is not something that they teach in school. They just teach you to go to school. 80% of millennials have, a higher education, or have an advanced degree, but we have to pay for these degrees. And graduating right around the time of the recession, they tell you you have the education, but you don't have the experience, but they're not willing to give you the experience to pay for the education when you have student loans. So it's definitely interesting to see a lot of employers that are actually interested in keeping millennials or attracting millennials, because we definitely do have a lot of beneficial ideas and ideals to bring to organizations. In terms of the path that is most interesting to me, right now I am an AmeriCorps Vista, which is a volunteer in service to America. If you're not aware of what that is, it's similar to the Peace Corps. It's ran by the same government organization. It's just in America. So essentially, I'm a full-time volunteer, and I get a stipend. Essentially, it was a decision that I had to make. It's one of the best decisions that I've ever made, because I have so much. I'm doing something. I mean something. The organization is growing because I'm here. So hearing, that meaningful work is important to millennials resonates extremely with me. However, having a passion for nonprofit and giving back to others, and being in a situation before this where I was treated more like I'm paying you, so I own you, that work first mentality, it puts a lot of things in perspective. And I think what appeals to me is similar to what you guys were saying in terms of building up a certain financial pot, so to speak,
Yep.
and working first. And right now I'm looking into opportunities in DC, but I'm also keeping my eye out for opportunities that will encourage a flexible career, looking into nonprofit organizations that encourage working from home or working remotely. So I definitely plan on making sure that my skill set will be beneficial, and I'll have more experience to offer in a flexible situation, so I can kind of maintain that when me and my husband are ready to move into that realm of, spawning children. So I want to be able to financially support my children, but I also want to be able to support my passion to help people. So it's definitely one of those building processes, and probably working first now with several jobs. That way we can have a foundation, a financial foundation. That way once I move into a more flexible arena, I'll be able to kind of explain to my kids, like, hey, you know, it's important to have money, but it's important to know that you're more than money.
Yeah.
And that's just something that I really want to pass on to my kids. So I think it's important that's one of the trade-offs, making sure that you have a financial foundation before being able to be in that level of flexibility in case there's some uncertainty in the future.
Wow, such wisdom! I actually feel like I'm hearing from this wonderful group of millennials. You know, it is really this mix of looking at work, looking at family, looking at money, and thinking and doing some intentional planning around it. Not just for yourself, but you and your partner. That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Ariel. That was really powerful. Simone, if you wanted to unmute yourself, we'd love to hear your thoughts too. And what I put up is a slide to let people know that we are going to be creating a millennial working group this year where we have about 10 millennials helping us think about how do we support millennials to keep on reaching for their goals around work, family, and their financial security so that they can really thrive in an integrated approach if that's their interest. So Simone, welcome for joining our call. We have a couple minutes left. We want to hear your thoughts. What did you find surprising from today? What did you think about? How did it make you think about your own career path?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay first?
Yes, wonderful.
All right, no problem. I will be quick, but just to kind of segue a little bit, I do think that I had similar sentiments growing, finishing my bachelor's degree and having that uncertainty of will I work, will I not, will I receive a piece of paper and end up in, you know, in my parents' basement for the next 15 years. Like there was a lot of articles, a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty. And I know that for me, at least, when I think about my own career, when I think about being a millennial, I've typically been the youngest person within my own office if I have worked in a traditional office environment. And so I've had to be very cognizant of the way, of my own mentality, and it becomes very, very clear, especially as you continue working with people. I think that I kind of represent a faction of millennials that are very ambitious, very career-driven, and very much have a hard time finding, on occasion, those meritocracies and those organizations in which, you know, the work that's produced or the quality or the innovation is truly valued. I think that for at least for me, some of the experiences that I've had in larger corporate offices has been working for, I think, more of a generation, not a baby boomer generation, but maybe like a Gen X or a little earlier, where you run into people who are incredible team players and very collaborative, but people who really do believe in a tenure and a checklist and a wait list with regard to advancing or opportunity, and they're not so black and white. So I think that I actually belong to a group of millennials that may be frequently written about for better or for worse, that are very, very ambitious. And I work in a sales environment within the nonprofit world, and I've been a fundraiser for some time, and I've always had the most success or the most joy with that flexibility. It's just come down to the fact that I love what I do, but I think maybe opposite of a comment that was mentioned earlier about the emphasis on my relationships within the office, I have a very personal emphasis on the work and in believing that the company that I'm working for or that I'm contracting for is effective, and in trying to make that company more effective. And I really do like to take the risks and put in the work and also get the reward for that work independent of tenure or time served. And so for me, that's always much more important, has always been much more important than my participation in the office. And I've loved working for groups in which I had a task and I executed it or exceeded it, and that was valued more so than maybe the face time or the attendance at the family picnics and things of that sort.
Wonderful. Hey, you know what I hear, Jennifer? Listening to Simone's story too, it really shows the diversity out there. Obviously, there are some commonalities amongst this age group because of some of the things that they lived through, 9/11, the financial crash, but there are all obviously some real diversities in that too. And what a great way to get to the end of the call, to hear three very different stories, but similar stories of what millennials are looking for. So what I want to do is give you the last word, Jennifer. You've done a great book summarizing important information. I hope today's call highlighted some of it. What else would you like to add that you think is important for us to hear about today? Do you have any thoughts you want to share with the millennials who shared their stories today?
probably the last thing that comes to mind is to remember that there are more differences within a generation than there are between generations. And so people attribute things to generations rather than thinking about the individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And you should really just always think about the individual because the generation doesn't give you much. Knowing someone's generation doesn't actually tell you a great deal. What tells you a lot more is their life stage, what level they are in the organization, and what they themselves have said. Because again, there's more difference within a generation, more variability within a generation than there is between generations.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing for everybody to remember.
Yeah. Yeah, we could really hear that in the stories that we heard today too. Well, that was wonderful. So what I'm going to do next is stop recording the call and then encourage people to share some questions. If